For a long time, the story of how the dinosaurs disappeared felt like one of those puzzles with too many missing pieces. Scientists knew the extinction happened. They knew roughly when, but the exact cause remained genuinely contested for decades. Two very different geological culprits were competing for the title of planetary killer, and the debate was anything but settled. The Cretaceous Paleogene boundary marks the moment roughly 66 million years ago when the dinosaurs simply stopped being part of Earth's story. On one side of the argument sat a catastrophic asteroid impact near what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. On the other side sat something slower, stranger, and in some ways even harder to fully comprehend. Before the scientific community landed firmly on the asteroid explanation, many serious researchers were looking at a volcanic formation on the other side of the world. That formation sits in India, and its scale is the kind of thing that makes normal geological vocabulary feel completely inadequate. The story of how these two theories collided is one of the more fascinating chapters in the history of Earth science. The formation in question is called the Deccan Traps, and describing it requires you to mentally resize your understanding of what a volcanic event can look like. It is not a volcano in the way most people picture one, a cone-shaped mountain with a dramatic summit. Instead, it is a large, igneous province which sits at the top of a hierarchy that goes regular volcano, then supervolcano, then something like this. The Deccan Traps cover roughly 1/3 of the entire Indian subcontinent, which is a number that sounds wrong the first time you hear it. Imagine the ground across that entire area not as solid Earth, but as an active, churning lake of lava extending as far as the eye could reach in every direction. The eruptions that built this formation did not last days or years, but continued for approximately 600,000 years without meaningful interruption. That is not a typo or an exaggeration. 600,000 years of volcanic activity pouring across 1/3 of a subcontinent. There is no modern analog for this, no current event that gives us a useful comparison for the sheer sustained scale of it. The Deccan Traps represent a category of geological violence that simply does not exist in the world we inhabit today. Understanding that helps explain why scientists took them seriously as a candidate for the extinction event. The timing of the Deccan Traps eruptions made them scientifically impossible to ignore as a potential cause of the dinosaur extinction. These eruptions did not happen in some random geological era with no connection to anything else significant. They happened to coincide with remarkable precision with the very boundary event that marks the end of the dinosaurs. Scientists call this the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, the line in the geological record where the non-avian dinosaurs simply vanish. For a significant period, many researchers believed the Deccan Traps were the smoking gun, or more accurately, the smoking continent. The reasoning made intuitive sense. Sustained volcanic activity on that scale would release enormous quantities of gases into the atmosphere. Those gases would alter climate, disrupt ecosystems, and create cascading failures across the food chain that could drive species after species into extinction. It was a compelling, evidence-supported hypothesis that held serious scientific standing for years. The fact that it eventually lost ground does not mean it was unreasonable. It means science worked the way it is supposed to work. A better explanation emerged, and the field updated accordingly. That better explanation arrived in the form of the Chicxulub crater, buried beneath the Gulf of Mexico near the Yucatan Peninsula. The crater is the preserved scar of an asteroid or comet impact so powerful that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of life on Earth. Once this impact site was identified and its timing confirmed, the scientific community gradually coalesced around it as the primary driver of the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. The evidence connecting Chicxulub to the extinction boundary is dense, multi-sourced, and globally distributed. A layer of iridium found in rock strata worldwide, shock quartz formations, and the crater's own geometry all tell the same story. This does not mean the Deccan Traps became irrelevant to the conversation. They simply stepped out of the starring role. The asteroid impact took center stage as the dominant explanation, and the volcanic formation shifted into a supporting position in the narrative. What makes this story more interesting, though, is that the supporting position the Deccan Traps occupy is genuinely strange. Their relationship to the Chicxulub impact may be far more direct than anyone initially suspected. The two events may not have been coincidental at all. Here is the detail that transforms this from a story about competing theories into something genuinely unsettling to think about. The Deccan Traps and the Chicxulub impact site are located on almost exactly opposite sides of the planet from each other. Scientists use the term antipodal to describe 2 points that sit at precise geographic opposites on a sphere, and these two locations are very nearly antipodal to one another. That geometric relationship gave rise to a theory that is not yet proven, but has not been dismissed either. The hypothesis proposes that when the Chicxulub impactor struck with its incomprehensible force, it sent shockwaves radiating outward through the body of the Earth in every direction simultaneously. Those waves traveled through rock, through mantle, through everything, following the curvature of the planet. On the far side of the world, at the antipodal point, all those shockwaves arrived at the same location at the same moment and converged with amplified, concentrated energy. The geological stress at that convergence point may have been enough to destabilize the crust and trigger or dramatically intensify the volcanic activity that became the Deccan Traps. It is a theory that requires a certain kind of mental flexibility to sit with comfortably. The antipodal shockwave hypothesis is still debated, and the scientific community has not reached consensus on whether it actually explains the Deccan Traps eruptions. What makes it compelling is not just the geographic coincidence, but the physical logic underlying it. Shockwaves do behave this way, and the math of energy convergence at an antipodal point is not fantasy. What remains unclear is whether the magnitude of the Chicxulub impact was sufficient to produce volcanic consequences of the scale we see in India. Some researchers argue the timing of intensified Deccan Traps activity correlates too closely with the impact to be purely accidental. Others maintain that the volcanic activity was already well underway before the asteroid arrived, and that the connection is being overstated. The honest answer is that the debate continues, and the evidence has not yet fully resolved the question in either direction. What is clear is that the Deccan Traps did have some effect on the environment and on species during the extinction period. The only real argument is about how much of the extinction burden they carried compared to the asteroid. That argument turns out to matter quite a lot for how we understand the event as a whole. Consider what it would mean if both the asteroid and the volcanic formation were meaningfully responsible for the extinction of the dinosaurs. It would mean that the most famous extinction event in Earth's history was not a single catastrophic blow, but a convergence of separate catastrophes arriving in close succession. The asteroid strikes, the sky darkens, temperatures plummet, ecosystems collapse, and simultaneously or shortly thereafter, a third of a subcontinent is erupting in sustained volcanic fury for hundreds of thousands of years. Any species already weakened by one of these events would face the second in a compromised state, with fewer resources, reduced populations, and disrupted food webs. The combined pressure of both events simultaneously would be exponentially more lethal than either one operating alone. Scientists sometimes describe this kind of convergence as a perfect storm, and in this case the metaphor feels genuinely earned rather than merely rhetorical. The dinosaurs may not have been eliminated by one precise geological moment, but ground down by a relentless sequence of overlapping disasters. That reframes the extinction not as a sudden execution, but as a prolonged collapse under compounding pressure. It is a darker and more complicated picture than the clean asteroid story, and it may be closer to the truth. What this story reveals about Earth's history is something that tends to get lost in the day-to-day experience of living on this planet. Extinction-level events are not anomalies in the geological record. They are recurring features of it, appearing with a regularity that is genuinely difficult to process emotionally. The Earth has not been a stable, benevolent host for life throughout its history, but an active, volatile system capable of catastrophic reorganization on timescales both sudden and gradual. The 5 major mass extinctions we have identified in the fossil record each erased enormous percentages of species, and each was driven by forces operating at a scale beyond anything in human experience. The Deccan Traps and Chicxulub together represent something even more specific: the possibility that extinction-level events can stack, overlap, and amplify each other in ways that make survival essentially impossible for most complex life. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is an accurate one. The history of life on Earth is not a story of steady progress, but of repeated near-total erasure, followed by rebuilding from whatever survived. We exist because something in our lineage made it through each of those filters, not because the planet was careful with us. The question that naturally follows from all of this is one that sits somewhere between intellectual curiosity and genuine existential unease. If extinction-level events have happened repeatedly throughout Earth's history, and if they can apparently happen in pairs or clusters, then the relevant question is not whether they will happen again, but when. The geological clock does not pause out of consideration for the species currently occupying the planet's surface. Asteroids still travel through the solar system on trajectories that occasionally intersect with Earth's orbit. Large igneous provinces have formed before, and the conditions that produce them have not permanently disappeared from the planet's interior. The same forces that shaped the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary are still present in the system, operating on timescales that dwarf human civilization entirely. This is not catastrophism for its own sake. It is simply what the geological record tells us when we read it carefully and honestly. The Deccan Traps and Chicxulub are not ancient curiosities from an irrelevant past, but data points in an ongoing story. Understanding them is part of understanding the full context of our existence on this particular planet. And once you understand that context clearly, one question tends to surface with quiet persistence. When is the next one? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and the geological record does not offer reassurance simply because we would prefer it. The same evidence that tells us extinction-level events have happened before tells us, with equal clarity, that they will happen again. The Cretaceous Paleogene boundary is one entry in a long list, not the final chapter of a closed book. What the Deccan Traps story adds to this picture is the reminder that these events do not always arrive alone or in isolation. Sometimes they converge, amplify, and compound in ways that leave almost nothing standing. The fact that we are here at all, descended from whatever survived those convergences, is genuinely remarkable when considered against the full sweep of Earth's history. But remarkable survival in the past does not constitute a guarantee for the future, and the geological record is not in the business of offering guarantees. The forces that ended the age of dinosaurs are still part of the same planetary system we inhabit today. That is worth sitting with, even if sitting with it is uncomfortable. The discomfort, at least, means you are paying attention. That question echoes differently when you stop thinking about deep time and start thinking about human time instead. The geological record deals in millions of years, but human history has its own catalog of catastrophic events worth examining closely. When researchers began compiling the deadliest disasters that occurred, while people were actually present to experience them, the results were not what most people expect. The dominant killers in human history were not earthquakes, not volcanic eruptions, not the dramatic geological violence described in the previous pages. They were quieter, slower, and in some ways more terrifying precisely because they unfolded over years rather than moments. Famines and floods sit at the top of the list, not because they are more powerful than geological events, but because they are more efficient at reaching people. The death tolls attached to these events are numbers that resist easy comprehension, the kind that require deliberate effort to process as something real. Understanding which disasters have actually killed the most people changes how you think about the question of what we should fear most. The historical record is a more honest guide than intuition, and intuition tends to dramatize the wrong things. So the inventory begins not with fire from the sky, but with failed harvests and empty fields. India appears in the historical record with devastating frequency when the subject is famine-driven mass death. The Chalisa famine and the Doji Bara famine arrived almost simultaneously, overlapping across the years 1783 to 1792 in a compounding agricultural catastrophe. Two mega-famines stacked on top of each other across the same region within the same decade. The timing alone suggests something systemic rather than merely unlucky. Together, they killed approximately 11 million people, a figure that requires a moment of genuine stillness before moving past it. A century later, the same subcontinent endured another catastrophic failure of food systems, this time between 1876 and 1878. That famine was triggered by a severe El Niño event that disrupted monsoon patterns with brutal precision, draining moisture from a region that depended on it entirely. The death toll from that event reached somewhere between 5.5 and 10 million people, a range that reflects how difficult it is to count the dead in a famine. The uncertainty in those numbers is itself a kind of testament to the scale of the chaos involved. What these events share is not just geography, but a particular vulnerability, a population dependent on seasonal rainfall that could not survive when the seasons failed. India's recurring appearance in these records reflects not a unique weakness, but simply the arithmetic of large populations meeting unreliable climates. China occupies the upper tiers of this grim inventory with 3 separate entries, each one exceeding what most people would consider imaginable. The famine of 1928 to 1930 killed somewhere between 3 and 10 million people across a vast range that speaks to the chaos of documentation in that era. The North China famine of 1876 to 1879 reached deeper into the population, with estimates ranging from 9 to 13 million deaths across a region already strained by limited agricultural resilience. Both of those events are overshadowed, however, by the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961, which belongs to a different category of catastrophe entirely. That famine unfolded during the period of the Great Leap Forward, when agricultural policy was guided by ideology rather than agricultural knowledge, with predictable consequences. The death toll from those 3 years sits somewhere between 15 and 55 million people, a range so wide it almost resists being called an estimate. The lower bound alone would represent one of the deadliest events in recorded human history by a significant margin. The upper bound is a number that approaches the total casualties of some of the largest wars ever fought. What makes it particularly difficult to process is that it was not purely a natural disaster, but a collision between natural vulnerability and catastrophic human decision-making. The famines in China and India together suggest that population size transforms ordinary agricultural failure into something that can reshape a civilization. Droughts and famines are genuinely natural disasters, even when human decisions amplify their consequences, and their place in this inventory is earned. But there's another category of disaster that operates on an even larger scale when measured purely by bodies. If you're willing to classify plagues as natural disasters, and there's a reasonable argument that they qualify, then the numbers shift dramatically upward. Infectious disease has killed more human beings than any other force in recorded history, and the totals are large enough to make famine statistics look modest by comparison. The plague of Justinian, which swept through the Byzantine Empire and surrounding regions between 541 and 549, killed somewhere between 15 and 100 million people. That range is extraordinarily wide, and the width of it reflects how little reliable record-keeping survived from that period. It is a span of 85 million possible deaths, which is itself a staggering number. The uncertainty does not diminish the reality of what happened. It simply means the historical record was not built to capture it with precision. What the plague of Justinian established was a template for how a single pathogen, given the right conditions, could hollow out a civilization from the inside. The numbers attached to it are rough, but they are not small. The Spanish flu arrived more than 13 centuries later, in a world with newspapers, telegraphs, and at least the infrastructure of modern record-keeping, and the numbers are still almost as uncertain. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920 killed somewhere between 25 and 100 million people, a range that should feel embarrassing given the era in which it occurred. The fact that documentation was still so imprecise during a 20th century event speaks to how thoroughly the pandemic overwhelmed the systems meant to track it. What is not in dispute is that the Spanish flu moved through populations with a speed and lethality that no one was prepared to manage. It killed more people in a single year than the entire First World War killed across 4 years of industrialized combat. It struck young, healthy adults with particular ferocity, which inverted the usual pattern of infectious disease and made it even harder to anticipate or contain. The pandemic reached into nearly every inhabited region of the planet, following trade routes, military movements, and the ordinary patterns of human contact. It ended not because anyone stopped it, but because the virus ran out of new populations to infect and eventually burned itself out. The Spanish flu is a reminder that biological catastrophe does not require geological scale to reshape human history. It requires only a pathogen and enough people living close enough together to pass it along. The Black Death remains the most iconic plague in Western historical memory, and the numbers attached to it justify that reputation without requiring any embellishment. The bubonic plague swept through Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia between 1346 and 1353, killing somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. That lower bound alone represents a significant fraction of the entire global population at the time, and the upper bound suggests something closer to a civilizational near collapse in the affected regions. Some areas of Europe lost half or more of their population within a few years, a demographic catastrophe that took generations to recover from. The plague reshaped economies, altered social structures, disrupted religious institutions, and left a psychological scar on European culture that persisted for centuries. It was not a single event, but a recurring wave, returning in subsequent outbreaks that kept populations suppressed long after the initial epidemic passed. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, was not acting with intent. It was simply doing what pathogens do, finding hosts and replicating. But the scale of what it accomplished in those 7 years sits at the outer edge of what human civilization has ever survived. The Black Death is the benchmark against which other plagues are measured, and most of them fall short of it. One, however, does not. Smallpox is the deadliest pathogen in recorded human history by a margin that makes all the other entries in this inventory look modest. Over the course of approximately 500 years, smallpox killed between 300 and 500 million human beings, a number so large that it resists being held in the mind as a single coherent fact. It killed emperors and peasants, children and adults, the powerful and the powerless, with a democratic indifference that no social structure could buffer against. It disfigured those it did not kill, leaving survivors marked in ways that identified them for life as people who had survived something genuinely terrible. It crossed oceans with European colonizers and devastated indigenous populations in the Americas who had no prior exposure and therefore no acquired immunity. It was so embedded in human experience for so long that people developed cultural frameworks for accepting it as an ordinary feature of life rather than an exceptional catastrophe. The fact that it killed hundreds of millions is almost less remarkable than the fact that it did so across such an extended span of time, generation after generation, without ever being stopped. It was simply part of what it meant to be human, in a way that weather is part of what it means to live outdoors. And then, within living memory, something happened that had never happened before in the entire history of human disease. We eradicated it. That sentence deserves to sit alone for a moment before anything else is added to it. Human beings, through coordinated global effort, systematic vaccination campaigns, and sustained international cooperation across political divides, eliminated smallpox from the natural world. The last known naturally occurring case was recorded in 1977 in Somalia, and the World Health Organization declared the disease eradicated in 1980. A pathogen that had killed hundreds of millions of people over 5 centuries simply ceased to exist in the wild because we decided, collectively, that it should. There is no precedent for this in the relationship between humans and infectious disease. No other pathogen of comparable lethality has been removed from the equation through human action alone. The achievement required decades of work, enormous logistical complexity, and cooperation between nations that were simultaneously competing in a Cold War that threatened to end civilization by other means. It happened anyway. The smallpox eradication is one of the most genuinely extraordinary things our species has ever accomplished, and it receives a fraction of the cultural attention it deserves. Most people alive today have no direct experience of the disease, which is precisely the point. The success was so complete that it erased itself from lived experience. That invisibility is the truest measure of how thoroughly it worked. The inventory of human history disasters, famines, plagues, floods, tells one story about what has already nearly broken us and what we somehow survived. But survival of past catastrophes is not a prediction about future ones. And the scale of what killed millions of people in human history is not necessarily the scale of what could kill billions in a world with 8 times the population. The historical record is useful precisely because it shows us what forces have actually operated at civilizational scale, not just what forces we theorize might be dangerous. Droughts and famines remain active threats, amplified now by climate instability and the agricultural dependencies of densely populated regions. Novel pathogens continue to emerge from animal reservoirs and find their way into human populations, as the early 21st century demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity. The difference between the famines of the 18th century and the potential famines of the 22nd century is not the mechanism, but the scale. More people, more interconnected supply chains, more ways for a single disruption to cascade globally. The smallpox story offers a counterweight to this, a genuine proof of concept that coordinated human effort can eliminate a threat that seemed permanent and insurmountable. But the smallpox story also required centuries of suffering before the solution arrived. The question worth sitting with is whether we can move faster than that next time. All of this, the famines, the plagues, the accumulated death tolls of human history, belongs to the category of disasters that occurred while we were here to experience them. It is the record of what has tested us within the narrow window of recorded civilization. But the planet's history extends incomparably further back than our presence on it, and the forces that shaped the deep past were operating at scales that make even the worst human-era disasters look like local events. What killed the dinosaurs was not a famine or a plague. It was something that restructured the entire planetary environment simultaneously, eliminating not millions of individuals, but entire branches of the tree of life. The transition from human history catastrophes to Earth history catastrophes is not just a change of scale, but a change of category. When the question shifts from what has nearly broken us to what might not leave anything standing at all, the answer requires looking further back in time and further outward in space. The geological record has more to say on this subject, and what it says is not reassuring. The forces that caused the great extinction events are not historical artifacts. They are still present in the system, patient and indifferent, operating on timescales that have no particular regard for the civilizations currently occupying the surface. The forces that ended the age of dinosaurs are still present in the same planetary system we quietly inhabit today. Shifting from human-scale catastrophe to Earth-scale extinction requires more than adjusting the numbers upward by a few orders of magnitude. It requires abandoning the assumption that the worst is always something our species has already survived and cataloged. The geological record does not organize itself around human convenience or human timelines or human survival rates. It simply records what happened, in the order it happened, without editorial concern for whether the outcome was acceptable. What it records, when read carefully across its full depth, is a planet that has periodically reset itself with extraordinary thoroughness. The 5 major mass extinctions identified in the fossil record are not cautionary tales from a safely distant past. They are data points in an ongoing pattern, and patterns, by definition, continue. The transition from the history of human suffering to the history of planetary extinction is not a leap into speculation. It is simply a matter of reading the same evidence at a different resolution. The Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, sitting at approximately 66 million years ago, is the most familiar entry in this record of planetary resets. An asteroid or comet, the precise classification still occasionally debated, struck near the present-day Yucatan Peninsula with energy that defies intuitive comparison. The impact did not merely destroy the immediate region. It restructured the global atmosphere, darkened the sky, and collapsed food chains from the bottom upward. Non-avian dinosaurs, which had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 150 million years, simply ceased to exist within a geologically brief window of time. The Chicxulub crater buried beneath the Gulf of Mexico is the preserved evidence of that moment, and it is unambiguous in what it represents. This event is the one most people reach for when extinction-level impacts come up in conversation, and for good reason. It is the most recent, the best documented, and the one with the most culturally resonant victims. But it is not the oldest, not the largest, and not the only mechanism capable of producing that scale of biological erasure. The Cretaceous Paleogene boundary is actually the younger end of a much longer list. Reading only that entry and stopping there gives a dangerously incomplete picture of the full pattern. The late Triassic extinction, which occurred approximately 201 million years ago, was driven not by an impactor from space, but by volcanic violence originating within the Earth itself. The culprit in that case was the Siberian Traps, a large igneous province operating on a scale comparable to the Deccan Traps described earlier in this account. Sustained eruptions poured gases and particulates into the atmosphere over an extended period, disrupting climate systems with a slow, grinding thoroughness that left survivors few places to hide. This extinction cleared the ecological stage in ways that allowed the dinosaurs to rise and eventually dominate, which gives the Triassic extinction a strange narrative irony when viewed from the far end of time. The Deccan Traps, for all their staggering scale, were not even the only large igneous province to drive a mass extinction event across geological history. The planet has produced multiple formations of this type, in different locations, across different eras, with similar catastrophic results each time. That repetition is not coincidence. It reflects something fundamental about the dynamics of a geologically active planet with a hot interior and a thin, stressed crust. The Earth is not a stable platform. It is a pressurized system, and pressure, given enough time, always finds a way to release. The Triassic extinction is one record of what that release looks like at civilizational scale. The largest extinction event in Earth's history, however, belongs to neither the Triassic nor the Cretaceous, but to the boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods. Scientists call it the Great Dying, and the name earns its weight without any rhetorical inflation. Approximately 95% of all species on Earth were eliminated during this event, a figure that is almost impossible to process as a biological reality rather than an abstraction. Whatever survived the Permian Triassic boundary did so against odds that should have been insurmountable, clinging to existence in whatever environmental refuges remained viable. The cause, once again, was a supervolcano, an eruption or series of eruptions operating at a scale that makes the Deccan Traps look like a preliminary sketch. The Great Dying is the benchmark event, the one that dwarfs everything else in the extinction record and reframes what the word catastrophe actually means in geological context. It also establishes a pattern that is worth holding onto as the analysis moves forward. The two most destructive forces in Earth's extinction history are not exotic or hypothetical. They are asteroids arriving from space and volcanoes erupting from within. Both have operated before. Both are still capable of operating again. The question of when is not rhetorical. It is genuinely worth calculating. Narrowing the field to these two primary extinction mechanisms, impactor events and supervolcanic eruptions, allows for something more useful than general dread. It allows for actual statistical estimation of timescales, which is a more productive relationship with existential risk than pure anxiety. Extinction-level asteroid impacts of a scale that produced the Chicxulub crater occur, on average, approximately once every 100 million years. The Chicxulub impact itself happened roughly 65 to 66 million years ago, which means the statistical window before the next comparable event is still approximately 30 million years wide. That number is not a guarantee. The solar system is, as any planetary scientist will tell you, essentially a shooting gallery where the density of projectiles has decreased since the early formation period but never reached zero. Statistics describe averages across many events, not the behavior of any specific incoming object on any specific trajectory. A 100-million-year average does not mean the next impact is scheduled for 34 million years from now and will courteously wait its turn. It means that over a long enough sample, the frequency averages out to roughly that interval. The distinction matters because it means the threat is real and ongoing even when the statistical window suggests comfort. 30 million years of remaining statistical buffer is genuinely reassuring on a civilizational timescale, but is not a locked door. Supervolcanic eruptions operate on a timeline that is considerably more compressed and therefore considerably more relevant to anything resembling human planning horizons. Where extinction-level asteroid impacts occur roughly every 100 million years, supervolcano eruptions occur on a cycle of approximately 50,000 to 100,000 years. That is not a geological abstraction. It is a time frame that overlaps meaningfully with the entire span of modern human civilization. The most recent supervolcanic eruption on record was the Taupo volcano in New Zealand, which erupted approximately 26,500 years ago with an energy release that registered across the global geological record. If the eruption cycle runs at its lower estimate of 50,000 years, the statistical interval before the next comparable event is somewhere around 26,000 years from the present. That is not 30 million years of breathing room. It is a number that sits within the same order of magnitude as recorded human history, just extended outward rather than backward. There are currently approximately 8 to 9 active supervolcanoes distributed around the planet, and Yellowstone is the one that occupies the most space in American cultural anxiety about this particular threat. That cultural focus is not entirely misplaced, though Yellowstone is far from the only candidate worth monitoring. The global distribution of active supervolcanoes means that no region of the planet is categorically safe from this particular mechanism of large-scale destruction. There is one additional variable worth inserting into this framework before the statistical picture feels complete, and it arrives from a direction that most people rarely think about when cataloging extinction risks. Gamma-ray bursts are among the most energetic events in the observable universe, produced by the collapse of massive stars or the collision of dense stellar remnants at distances that are almost impossible to intuitively grasp. When one occurs within a sufficiently close range and is oriented toward Earth, the resulting radiation could strip away significant portions of the ozone layer, exposing the surface to ultraviolet radiation at levels incompatible with most complex life. The estimated frequency of a gamma-ray burst close enough and correctly oriented to cause meaningful damage to Earth is approximately once every 250,000 years, which places it in a slower cycle than supervolcanic eruptions, but faster than extinction-level asteroid impacts. The scientific community has not reached full consensus on exactly how severe the biological consequences of such an event would be, and the debate around the mechanism and the damage threshold remains active. What makes gamma-ray bursts particularly interesting as a risk category is that they originate entirely outside the solar system, which means they are completely undetectable in advance with current technology. An asteroid can be tracked. A volcanic system can be monitored. A gamma-ray burst from a distant galaxy arrives without warning and without the possibility of any preparation. It is the wild card in a deck that already contains several dangerous cards. When these three mechanisms are placed side by side, asteroid impacts every 100 million years, supervolcanic eruptions every 50 to 100,000 years, gamma-ray bursts every 250,000 years. A clear hierarchy of near-term statistical concern emerges. The supervolcano is the most likely candidate to affect human civilization within any time frame that connects to our current moment on the planet. That conclusion sits uncomfortably alongside the fact that we have limited capacity to prevent a supervolcanic eruption, even with the most advanced technology currently available or foreseeable. We can track asteroids, and there are serious ongoing efforts to develop deflection capabilities for incoming impactors of dangerous size. We cannot meaningfully intervene in the geological processes that build pressure in a magma chamber beneath Yellowstone or any of the other active supervolcanic systems distributed across the planet. Monitoring provides warning, but warning without the ability to act is a specific kind of helplessness that does not improve simply by being well-informed. The statistical comfort of 26,000 remaining years is genuine on its own terms, but it is worth holding alongside the recognition that when the interval closes, there is no current mechanism for extending it. The Earth's interior operates on its own schedule, and our presence on the surface has not yet given us meaningful leverage over it. All of this framing, the asteroid impacts, the supervolcanoes, the gamma-ray bursts, the statistical windows, assumes that the next extinction-level event will arrive from outside the category of human activity. That assumption is increasingly difficult to defend without qualification. There is a serious and growing scientific argument that Earth is currently experiencing its sixth mass extinction event, unfolding not over hundreds of thousands of years, but across the compressed time frame of industrial civilization. The rate at which species are disappearing from the planet has accelerated dramatically since the beginning of large-scale industrialization, exceeding the background extinction rate by estimates that range from dozens to thousands of times the natural baseline. This event has a name: the Anthropocene extinction, named for the geological epoch defined by human influence on planetary systems. The mechanism is not an asteroid or a supervolcano, but something more diffuse and more difficult to assign to a single dramatic moment. It is the aggregate consequence of habitat destruction, resource extraction, climate disruption, pollution, and the relentless expansion of a single species into every ecological niche on the planet. We are, in the language of the extinction record, the large igneous province of the current geological moment, sustained, distributed, and operating across timescales that are short by geological standards, but long enough to be catastrophic for biodiversity. The question of whether the Anthropocene extinction will ultimately threaten the species causing it is not settled, and the answer depends heavily on how far the cascading effects of biodiversity loss are allowed to travel before they reach the systems that human civilization depends on directly. Ecosystems are not decorative features of the planet. They're the functional infrastructure that produces clean air, stable climate, fertile soil, and the biological diversity that underlies food security at every level. Removing species from that infrastructure at accelerating rates is not a process with a clean, predictable endpoint where the damage stops before reaching anything critical. It is a process of progressive destabilization, and destabilized systems do not fail gradually and politely. They fail in thresholds and cascades. The uncomfortable conclusion that emerges from placing all of this together is that the most statistically immediate extinction-level threat may not be the one arriving from space or erupting from beneath Yellowstone. It may be the one already underway, driven by the same species, now calculating the odds of the other ones. We're the asteroid, arriving in slow motion. We are the supervolcano, building pressure across centuries rather than millennia. The next mass extinction event may not be something we need to watch the sky for. It may be something we need to look at in the mirror, honestly and without flinching before the window for a different outcome closes entirely. Staring into that mirror honestly is something our species has historically preferred to avoid, which explains quite a lot about where we currently stand. The question of what comes next shifts now from planetary geology to something more immediately human in scale. If extinction-level events represent one end of the catastrophe spectrum, The other end belongs to us. Our politics, our tribalism, our persistent inability to agree on anything that matters long enough to act on it. The host arrived at this section of the conversation through a question that sounds almost naively optimistic when stated plainly. Someone wanted to know whether realistic world peace was achievable within the next 400 years, and the honest answer required sitting with some genuinely uncomfortable conclusions. 400 years sounds like a long runway, until you consider how little the fundamental architecture of human conflict has changed in the last 4,000. The question is not really about timelines or policy frameworks or diplomatic institutions, though those things matter at the margins. It is about something more stubborn and more deeply embedded in how our species actually operates when left to its own devices. Tribalism is not a bug in the human system that can be patched with the right incentive structure. It is a feature, and it has been running continuously since before we had cities or flags or reasons to invent either. The alien observer framing is a useful way into this problem because it strips away the justifications we normally use to make our behavior look reasonable. An extraterrestrial civilization watching Earth from a sufficient distance would not see Americans or Iranians or Europeans or any of the other categories we use to organize our conflicts and our loyalties. They would see a single species, genetically nearly identical across its entire population, occupying a single planet, consuming its shared resources, and spending an extraordinary percentage of its collective energy fighting with itself. From that vantage point, the distinctions that feel enormous and consequential to us, national borders, religious differences, economic systems, historical grievances, would be invisible at the relevant scale. What would be visible is the pattern. Constant, recurring, self-perpetuating conflict that never fully resolves and never fully stops. The host saw a film about alien disclosure around this time and came away thinking less about the aliens and more about what they would make of us as a civilization. The conclusion was not flattering, and the logic behind it is difficult to argue with once you allow yourself to see it from outside the usual frame. We are, from the outside, a species that looks permanently incapable of getting along with itself. The question of why any advanced civilization would want to engage with that is genuinely worth sitting with. The disclosure film prompted a conversation that most people eventually have if they think seriously about the conditions required for genuine world peace. The only realistic scenarios that produce planetary unity, when you trace them through honestly, tend to require either an external threat so overwhelming that internal divisions become temporarily irrelevant, or an internal force so powerful that it simply suppresses all disagreement by removing the option of dissent. Neither of those outcomes is what people mean when they say they want world peace, but they're what the logic of the problem actually delivers when you follow it without sentimentality. A hostile alien civilization arriving with clearly destructive intentions would probably do more for human unity in a week than any diplomatic institution has managed in centuries. That is a deeply uncomfortable observation, but it is not an unreasonable one. Shared external threat is one of the most reliable mechanisms for overriding tribal division in the historical record. The problem is that the unity it produces is temporary, instrumental, and dependent on the threat remaining present and credible. Remove the threat, and the old divisions reassert themselves with remarkable speed, as if they were simply waiting in a holding pattern for the emergency to pass. The alternative scenario, a world government powerful enough to enforce genuine peace across all human populations simultaneously, runs into a different and arguably more troubling set of problems. Imposing unified governance on a species as diverse and as stubbornly autonomous as ours requires a concentration of coercive power that has historically produced outcomes nobody actually wants to live inside. The host put this plainly and without much rhetorical softening. The thing that looks like world peace from a distance looks a lot like fascism from the inside. That is not hyperbole or political provocation. It is a structural observation about what it takes to suppress tribal conflict at a global scale without the consent of every tribe involved. Freedom and autonomy are not incidental features of human civilization that can be temporarily suspended while the peace infrastructure gets built and then restored afterward. They're the things people are fighting over in the first place. And any system that removes them in the name of harmony has simply replaced one form of violence with another. The chaos and conflict of a world with competing nations and competing interests is genuinely terrible. But it is terrible in a way that preserves the possibility of change. A perfectly enforced global peace that cannot be questioned or contested is terrible in a way that does not. A third scenario exists, sitting somewhere between the alien invasion and the authoritarian world government, and it is the one that the host found most interesting to think through, even if it led somewhere unsettling. What if the mechanism for removing human tribalism was not external military pressure or internal political force, but something biological, a pathogen or some other agent that altered the neurological substrate of tribal behavior itself? A worldwide pandemic that stripped away not just physical health, but the cognitive architecture that makes us divide ourselves into competing groups would technically solve the problem of tribalism. It would also solve the problem of human agency, which is the part that makes the scenario a horror story rather than a utopian vision. The host noted that this is essentially the premise of a television show called Plus Virus, and the fact that someone already wrote that story as a cautionary tale rather than a blueprint says something important about how we actually feel about the solution when it is made concrete. Wanting world peace in the abstract and wanting the specific mechanisms required to produce in reality are two very different things, and the distance between them is where most serious thinking about this subject eventually gets stuck. The Dumb and Dumber triple stamp exchange is a perfect cultural artifact for this moment in the conversation, and the host reached for it instinctively rather than deliberately. The scene involves two characters attempting to retroactively override a commitment through escalating declarations that cancel each other out, each one more absurd than the last, until the whole exchange collapses into noise. It lands here because the logic of world peace negotiations, at their most honest, follows a similar structure. Every agreement contains within it the seeds of the disagreement about whether the agreement actually counts, and every institution built to enforce agreements is immediately contested by the parties who believe the institution itself is illegitimate. You cannot triple stamp a double stamp. You cannot build a world government on the consent of populations who do not consent to world government. The comedy in the scene is inseparable from the genuine frustration it captures, which is why it has stayed in the cultural memory long after the film itself might have faded. The host used it not as a joke, but as a compressed argument about the recursive impossibility of getting everyone to agree on the terms of agreement. What the host arrived at, after following all of these threads to their logical conclusions, was not pessimism exactly, but something more like honest resignation about the near-term prospects. World peace sounds genuinely good when stated as an aspiration, and the desire behind the question is completely understandable and worth taking seriously. The problem is not the goal, but the gap between the goal and any realistic mechanism for achieving it within the constraints of actual human psychology and actual human history. The host's honest answer was that the path to world peace, in any scenario he could actually imagine working, runs through something he would not want to live through. That is a different kind of conclusion than simply saying it is impossible. It is saying that the cost of the thing, when calculated honestly, may be higher than the thing is worth. That is not a comfortable position, and the host acknowledged it as such without trying to soften it into something more palatable. The laughter at the end of the section was not dismissive, but the specific kind of laugh that acknowledges you have arrived somewhere, genuinely bleak, through entirely reasonable steps, and there's nothing left to do but notice it. The conversation about world peace connects back to the extinction discussion in a way that the host did not make fully explicit, but that sits just beneath the surface of the logic. The same tribal instincts that make world peace structurally difficult are also the instincts that make coordinated responses to global threats structurally difficult. Responding to climate change, to pandemic risk, to the slow-motion Anthropocene extinction described in the previous section, all require exactly the kind of sustained global cooperation that the world peace question reveals to be nearly impossible without coercion. The alien observer framing applies equally well to both problems. From the outside, a species that cannot coordinate its own governance to prevent its own extinction looks like a species that has not yet decided it wants to survive badly enough to do what survival requires. That is a harsh framing, and it may not be entirely fair because there are genuine examples of coordinated global action. The smallpox eradication being the most striking, that demonstrate the capacity exists when the conditions are right. But the conditions that made smallpox eradication possible were specific and not easily replicated, and the problems that require coordination now are considerably more complex and more politically contentious than a vaccination campaign. The question of what would actually change the equation is the one worth sitting with after everything else in this section has been processed. The host gestured toward alien contact as the most plausible unifying force available to us, and the logic is not entirely facetious. A confirmed, unambiguous encounter with another civilization, whether hostile or peaceful, would do something to the human sense of collective identity that no political institution or diplomatic treaty has ever managed. It would make the category of human feel real in a way that it currently does not, because the category only becomes legible against something that is genuinely not human. The irony is that the thing most likely to make us stop fighting each other long enough to cooperate would have to arrive from somewhere we have not yet looked. Everything within the system, every internal threat, every shared problem, every rational argument for cooperation has already been tried and has already demonstrated its limitations. The external perspective, the one that sees us as a single species on a single planet behaving with inexplicable self-destructiveness, might be the only mirror powerful enough to actually change the reflection. The host did not claim this was likely. He claimed it was the most honest answer he could give to a question that deserved one. The answer to the world peace question is, finally, that it is probably achievable in theory and probably not achievable in practice within any time frame that connects to the present moment, which is its own kind of answer. The host moved on from it not because the question was not worth taking seriously, but because he had followed it as far as honest thinking would take him and arrived at a wall. What comes after the wall is speculation, and the host prefers his speculation grounded in something more than wishful thinking about human nature improving faster than human history suggests it will. The next question in the sequence turns the lens from the species as a whole to something considerably more intimate. The specific and somewhat strange fact that human beings arrive in the world almost entirely helpless, dependent on sustained external care for years before they can manage even basic independent function. Other species do not work this way, and the gap between a newborn foal standing within hours of birth and a human infant who cannot lift its own head for months raises a question that turns out to have several competing answers, none of them fully settled. The biology of human helplessness is more interesting than it first appears, and the explanation reaches further into questions of culture and cognition than a purely mechanical account would suggest. The biology of human helplessness opens a door into something stranger and more revealing than a simple developmental quirk. Most people encounter this question the way the host did, watching an animal documentary and feeling vaguely embarrassed on behalf of our species. A foal stands within hours. A human infant cannot hold its own head upright for months after arrival. The gap between those two timelines is not a design flaw in the conventional sense, but it is absolutely a design choice that evolution made under specific pressures. Understanding why requires setting aside the assumption that longer gestation would always produce a more capable infant. The relationship between brain size, birth timing, and survival is considerably more tangled than that intuition suggests. There are at least 3 competing explanations for why human babies arrive in such a profoundly unfinished state, and none of them has fully displaced the others in the scientific literature. Each one illuminates a different dimension of what it actually means to be human, which is why the question turns out to be more interesting than it first appears. The host went looking for a simple mechanical answer and found something considerably more layered waiting on the other side of it. The first and longest-standing explanation centers on the relationship between brain size and the female pelvis, which turns out to be a genuinely constrained engineering problem. Human brains are extraordinarily large relative to body size, and a fully developed human brain requires a skull of corresponding dimensions to contain it. The birth canal, however, is bounded by the width of the pelvis, which is itself constrained by the requirements of upright bipedal locomotion. A pelvis wide enough to accommodate a fully neurologically developed infant would impose significant energetic costs on walking and running, which are survival-critical activities in the environments where our ancestors lived. Nature, being the relentless optimizer that it is, landed on a compromise. Deliver the infant earlier, before the skull reaches its full developmental size, and then continue development outside the womb, where the pelvis is no longer the limiting constraint. One estimate puts the required gestation period for a neurologically comparable chimpanzee birth at somewhere between 18 and 21 months, rather than the 9 months that human pregnancy actually runs. That is not a small gap. It is essentially doubling the internal development period, which the pelvis simply cannot accommodate without making walking prohibitively expensive. A newer theory challenges the pelvic explanation directly, proposing that the limiting factor is not structural but metabolic, which reframes the entire problem in a different register. Holly Dunsworth and her colleagues at the University of Rhode Island developed what they called the obstetrical dilemma hypothesis, which argues that the mother's metabolic capacity, rather than her pelvic geometry, is what determines when birth must occur. Carrying a developing fetus is energetically expensive in ways that compound as the fetus grows larger and more metabolically demanding. At a certain point, the combined metabolic burden of the mother's own maintenance and the fetus's developmental requirements exceeds what the mother can sustainably provide. The data supporting this view comes from a broad comparative analysis of mammals, suggesting that the relationship between gestation length and fetal growth follows metabolic constraints that operate consistently across species. The pelvic story, by this account, is not wrong exactly, but is downstream of a more fundamental biological ceiling. The mother's body is not primarily constrained by the width of a birth canal, but by the energy budget available to sustain two metabolically active organisms simultaneously. When that budget reaches its limit, the fetus exits whether or not it is neurologically ready for the world outside. What makes the metabolic explanation compelling is that it connects human birth timing to a pattern visible across the entire mammalian lineage rather than treating it as a uniquely human quirk. Every mammal faces some version of this trade-off between internal development and external delivery, and the solutions are distributed across a wide spectrum. Some species invest heavily in internal development and produce offspring that are nearly independent from birth. Others, like humans, deliver early and invest heavily in external care instead, shifting the developmental burden from the womb to the social environment. The energetic logic is consistent even when the specific solutions look very different from the outside. What distinguishes humans within this spectrum is not just that we deliver early, but that we have the cognitive and social infrastructure to sustain prolonged external care in ways that most other species do not. Hands capable of holding and carrying an infant, social groups capable of distributing caregiving responsibilities, and the cognitive capacity to anticipate and respond to infant needs all make extended external development viable in a way it simply would not be for a less socially complex species. The metabolic constraint and the social capacity evolve together, each one making the other more viable over time. The third explanation is the one that the host found most interesting, and it is the one that reaches furthest beyond simple biology into questions about what kind of creature we actually are. Adolf Portman proposed in the 1960s that human infants may be born early not despite being cultural animals, but precisely because they are cultural animals. The argument is that arriving in the world before neurological development is complete allows the infant to absorb the specific cultural environment it is born into rather than arriving with a fixed behavioral architecture already installed. A more fully developed infant might be harder to culturally program, in the same way that older children are harder to teach new languages than younger ones. The flexibility of the developing brain, its extraordinary capacity to be shaped by early experience, may be a feature rather than a limitation. Being born neurologically unfinished means being born maximally open to the particular rules, norms, and patterns of the specific human society waiting on the other side of birth. That openness is what allows a single species to produce the extraordinary cultural diversity visible across human civilizations, with each infant calibrated to its own local version of the shared human project. The cultural calibration theory has an interesting implication that the host paused on, which is that human helplessness at birth may be a kind of investment rather than a cost. Every other species on the list of capable newborns is buying early independence at the price of cultural flexibility. The foal that stands within ours is already largely committed to being a horse in the way that horses are. The human infant that cannot lift its head is still, in a meaningful sense, being written. The months and years of dependency are not wasted time, but active developmental time, during which the infant's brain is being shaped by everything it encounters. Language, faces, emotional patterns, social rules, the specific textures of the culture it has been born into. The cost of that process is enormous in terms of parental investment and social infrastructure required to sustain it. The return on that investment is a creature capable of learning to be almost anything, depending on where and when and among whom it arrives. That flexibility is arguably the defining characteristic of the species, the thing that allowed humans to occupy every climate zone on Earth, to build wildly different civilizations on every inhabited continent, and to keep surprising themselves with what they turn out to be capable of when circumstances change. None of these three explanations has achieved the kind of consensus that would allow any of them to be declared the definitive answer, which is itself an interesting fact about the state of the science. The pelvic constraint hypothesis held the field for decades before the metabolic theory offered a serious challenge. The cultural calibration theory adds a dimension that neither of the first two fully captures, but remains harder to test empirically than a structural or metabolic mechanism. What the host found in the scientific literature was not a clean resolution, but an ongoing conversation between researchers who are each illuminating a different facet of the same complex phenomenon. That is actually how most interesting questions in biology work. Not as puzzles with single correct answers waiting to be unlocked, but as layered problems where each new explanation reveals additional structure rather than replacing everything that came before. The honest summary is that human infants are born early because of some combination of pelvic geometry, metabolic limits, and cultural adaptability, and the precise weighting of those factors remains genuinely contested among people who study this for a living. What the question about animal versus human babies ultimately reveals is something the host found worth sitting with beyond the specific scientific debate. Every explanation for human helplessness at birth points back toward the same underlying reality. We are a species that outsources an extraordinary amount of our development to the social environment rather than completing it internally. That outsourcing is only possible because we have built social structures capable of sustaining it. Family units, community networks, cultural institutions that transmit knowledge across generations. Remove those structures, and the human infant is not just helpless, but genuinely unviable in a way that a foal or a calf is not. We are, in a very literal biological sense, dependent on each other from the first moment of existence in a way that most other species are not. That dependency does not diminish at birth. It simply changes form as the years pass, becoming less about physical survival and more about the cultural and cognitive development that makes a human being recognizable as such. The helplessness of the newborn and the complexity of the adult are not opposites, but two ends of the same developmental arc. And the arc only works because other humans are present at every point along it. The question of what you used to believe and no longer do, and what you once dismissed and now hold as true, is one that most people avoid asking themselves with any real precision. The host was asked this directly and chose to answer it honestly rather than safely, which meant going somewhere that he knew would generate friction. The JFK assassination is the example he reached for on the first half of the question, and the choice is revealing precisely because it is not a comfortable one to make publicly. He described absorbing the conspiracy framework completely. The Oliver Stone film, the Donald Sutherland and Kevin Costner scene, where Mr. X lays out the case in cascading detail, the whole architecture of alternative explanation that the film presents with such persuasive momentum. That material landed in him as truth, not as one interpretation among many, but as the real story underneath the official story. The shift away from that position was gradual rather than sudden, driven less by any single counterargument than by a broader change in how he relates to explanatory frameworks that require hidden coordination at scale. The JFK conspiracy theories are now, statistically, more widely believed than the lone gunman account, which is itself a strange fact worth noting. The meditation-derived insight about thoughts and identity is where the section lands, and it is the more personally significant of the two answers, even if it generates less immediate controversy. The host described arriving, through years of practice, at a relationship with his own thinking that most people never quite reach. The recognition that a thought appearing in your mind is not the same thing as a belief you hold or a truth you endorse. Thoughts are events in the brain, produced by processes that are not always under conscious direction, and the mistake of treating every thought as a declaration of identity creates a kind of cognitive rigidity that makes updating beliefs feel like a threat to the self. The subconscious is not a unified voice, but a collection of competing processes, each one occasionally surfacing into awareness and demanding to be taken seriously. Learning to observe that process without immediately endorsing its output is not the same as becoming indifferent or passive. It is actually what makes genuine intellectual flexibility possible. The host offered this not as a prescription, but as something that had changed his own experience in ways he found genuinely valuable, and the invitation at the end, "Join me," was warm rather than evangelical, the kind of thing you say when you have found something useful and want to share it without insisting. The invitation to join him in that quieter relationship with thought is where the personal section ends and something lighter begins. Not every question in a lightning round needs to carry the weight of extinction or the architecture of human conflict. Some questions arrive like a window cracking open in a stuffy room, letting in something small and ridiculous and genuinely welcome. The jet lag question is exactly the kind of window, and the host walked through it without hesitation or apology. Jet Lag the Game is a show built around travel, competition, and the specific chaos of navigating unfamiliar places under pressure. Ben and Adam are the hosts, and they have a recurring segment called the Snack Zone, where they sample local foods from wherever the show has taken them. The segment is cheerful and low stakes, and exactly the kind of thing that makes a long-running show feel like spending time with people you actually know. The host had one answer to the question of what they should eat, and he held it with the conviction of someone who has thought about this longer than the question probably deserved. That answer is surströmming, the Swedish fermented fish that arrives in a pressurized can and announces itself before anyone has made a decision about opening it. The case for surströmming as the definitive snack zone challenge rests entirely on the documented reactions of everyone who has ever attempted it on camera. It is not merely an unusual food. It is a sensory event that reorganizes the immediate environment around the person experiencing it. The fermentation process that produces it is not subtle or polite, but aggressive and complete, generating a smell that has caused people to abandon vehicles and exit buildings with genuine urgency. The host has watched enough of these attempts to know what the footage looks like, and what it looks like is compelling television by any reasonable standard. The specific detail he added is important. They need to be in a car. The enclosed space is not a cruel addition, but a narrative one, because the car removes the option of simply walking away from the decision once it has been made. Ben and Adam, sitting in a moving vehicle with an open can of fermented Swedish fish, represents a scenario with no dignified exit and therefore unlimited entertainment potential. Put it on a cracker, the host suggested, as if the cracker were the variable that would make the experience manageable rather than simply the final touch on something already committed to being memorable. The transition from fermented fish to a 200-meter wall of water, moving through a Greenland fjord, is the kind of tonal shift that lightning-round videos handle better than almost any other format. Donna Sawyer asked about a 650-foot tsunami from 2023, and the host admitted he had missed it entirely when it happened. That admission is worth something, because a wave of that scale sounds like the kind of event that should be impossible to miss in the news cycle. The reason it stayed quiet is actually embedded in the event itself, an understanding that requires understanding where it happened and what kind of place it is. The Dixon Fjord sits in East Greenland, which is not a place that appears frequently in daily news coverage under any circumstances. It is remote in the specific way that Greenland is remote. Not just geographically distant, but functionally outside the radius of most people's awareness unless something extraordinary happens there. Something extraordinary did happen there in September of 2023, and the extraordinary part is not just the wave height, but the chain of geological circumstances that produced it. Glacial retreat, destabilized rock, a narrow water channel, and the physics of oscillating energy in a confined space all contributed to what happened in that fjord. The mechanism behind the Dixon Fjord megatsunami is the kind of geological process that feels almost too elegant to be as destructive as it was. As the glacier that had occupied the fjord retreated due to warming temperatures, it left behind rock that had been structurally supported by the ice for an extended period. Without that support, the rock became unstable in the specific way that things become unstable when the thing holding them in place is gradually removed. A landslide followed, sending a large volume of material into the water of the fjord with enough force to generate a wave. The fjord's geometry did the rest. Because a narrow channel does not absorb wave energy the way open water does, it concentrates and amplifies it, forcing the energy upward rather than outward. The wave reached approximately 200 meters in height, which converts to roughly 600 feet, a number that sits in the mind uncomfortably once you try to picture it against anything familiar. The oscillation continued back and forth across the fjord in what scientists call a seiche, a standing wave that keeps redistributing energy rather than dissipating it cleanly. The SWAT satellite, operated by NASA to monitor surface water and ocean topography, captured data from the event that allowed researchers to reconstruct the full progression of what happened. Ella Island sits within the Dixon Fjord system and has a small settlement that functions as a fishing community during the summer months. September is when that settlement is typically uninhabited, which is the detail that separates this event from a catastrophe and places it in the category of extraordinary geological occurrence without human casualties. The wave reached the settlement and caused physical damage to the structures there, but there were no injuries and no deaths because there was no one present to be injured or killed. That timing is the kind of coincidence that gets called luck in casual conversation and gets called something more complicated when you think about it in the context of a warming planet systematically destabilizing the geology of regions that were previously stable. The same glacial retreat that made the landslide possible is also what makes similar events more likely in the future, in Greenland and in other places where ice has been the structural support holding unstable terrain in place. The Dixon Fjord event was not just a geological curiosity, but a demonstration of a mechanism that climate change is actively enabling in multiple locations simultaneously. The fact that nobody was there this time is not a guarantee about the next time. The seismic signature of the event extended far beyond the fjord itself, which is the detail that elevates this from a local geological story to something with genuinely global implications for how we monitor the planet. The landslide and the resulting tsunami generated a seismic wave that traveled through the Earth's body and was detected by monitoring stations around the world for 9 consecutive days. 9 days is not a brief signal. It is a sustained resonance, the planet effectively ringing like a struck bell for more than a week after the initial event. Seismologists initially struggled to identify the source because the signal did not match the typical signature of an earthquake, which is what their instruments are primarily calibrated to detect. The unusual frequency and duration of the signal prompted an investigation that eventually traced it back to the Dixon Fjord landslide and the SAIS it generated. The SWAT satellite data confirmed what the seismic readings suggested, providing a multi-source picture of an event that had gone almost entirely unreported in mainstream media. The host noted that the combination of remote location and zero casualties probably explains why it did not reach most people's awareness, which is a reasonable explanation that also contains a slightly uncomfortable implication about what it takes for geological events to register as newsworthy. The YouTube algorithm question arrives last in the sequence, and it turns out to be the one that generates the most sustained energy from the host, which is itself a small piece of data about where his genuine investment lies. The question was whether the trend toward longer videos and compilation content reflects an algorithm change, and the answer is yes, and also no, and also something more interesting than either of those. Watch time has been a meaningful metric in the YouTube algorithm for years, which means longer videos have always had a structural advantage in terms of raw minutes accumulated per view. Compilation videos serve a specific function that the host experienced firsthand when he produced them during a period when outside commitments were limiting his production capacity. They turn out to work better than expected, not just as gap fillers, but as genuine entry points for new viewers encountering the channel for the first time. Someone watching 3 hours of compiled content from a creator they had never seen before is, by the end of that session, no longer a new viewer in any meaningful sense. The compilation format does something that individual videos cannot do as efficiently, which is compress a significant portion of a creator's catalog into a single viewing session. The mid-roll ad question is one the host addressed with more directness than the topic usually receives from creators, which is refreshing in a space where the economics of content creation are often discussed obliquely or not at all. The mechanics are simpler than most viewers assume. A creator selects whether a video will carry mid-roll advertising, and YouTube systems then determine the frequency and placement of those ads within the content. The creator does not add individual ads to specific timestamps in the way that a radio producer might schedule commercial breaks. What the host described doing when ad complaints appear in the comments is removing ads, not adding them, which inverts the assumption that longer videos are being engineered to maximize ad insertion points. The algorithm and the audience are not separate forces operating in opposition to each other, but reflections of the same underlying behavior, which is the insight the host kept returning to throughout this section. What the algorithm surfaces is a record of what viewers have actually done, what they watched for how long, on which devices, at what times of day, and creators respond to those signals the same way any system responds to feedback. The device-specific and time-specific variation in what the algorithm recommends is something the host described from direct personal observation rather than theoretical understanding. The same account produces different recommendations on a desktop computer, a phone, and a living room television, because the viewing behavior associated with each device is different, and the algorithm has learned to treat each context as a separate signal. Late-night viewing on a television tends towards slower, more visually satisfying content, because that is what people in that context have historically chosen. The algorithm is not making aesthetic judgments about what is good. It is pattern matching against the accumulated record of what people in similar contexts have previously selected. The creator who disappears from your feed after you miss a few of their videos has not been penalized by the system in any punitive sense. The system has simply registered the absence of engagement and adjusted its predictions accordingly, treating the gap as evidence of diminishing relevance to that particular viewer. Recovering the relationship requires the same thing that establishing it required in the first place: deliberate attention, actual engagement, and the decision to seek something out rather than waiting for it to arrive. The manifesto quality of the closing argument is earned rather than imposed, which is the difference between a creator who has thought seriously about the ecosystem they operate in and one who is simply venting frustration at a system they do not fully understand. Taking intentional control of your algorithm is not a technical intervention, but a behavioral one, and the behavior required is straightforward. Search for creators you have lost track of, watch several of their videos in sequence, and let the system register that renewed engagement as a signal worth responding to. The subscription tab exists and is consistently underused, which means the infrastructure for intentional viewing is